Anson, I was sweating it out today, worried about how you might introduce me. That was very kind of you. Very gracious, thank you. Suppliers today, competitors tomorrow. It is an absolutely fascinating but complex topic, and as I was sitting there, I thought that's a nice slogan for the sourcing sector in general. Fascinating but complex. To your relief, my experience is the pressures you're feeling are not restricted to the sourcing sector. I was having a conversation last week with the head of a global bank in Singapore who put the question to me. He said, how do we brand ourselves? How do we brand ourselves in a market where we face competition not only from global banks, but increasingly from local banks, and worse yet, regional banks that are looking to grow outside their home market. And it's that rise of local competition that is really shaking up business models across the region, including the sourcing model. So we're very fortunate today, as part of the final panel or final consignment, if you like, or under pressure to deliver, keep everyone awake. But I'm sure, though, we will both enlighten and entertain. We have a very distinguished panel today. We have both local and foreign manufacturers. We have firms that have global brands. We have firms that are looking to build global brands, or at the very least, regional brands. So really delighted at the quality of the panel. If I could introduce our panelists very briefly. The full bios are in the program packs. I start with Paul Melkadiki. He heads up the sourcing and supply team for Samsonite Asia. The region is clearly part of, or the biggest part, perhaps the most important part of your global network. Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome. Next, if I could introduce Gary Newman from Schneider Electric. Gary gave an excellent presentation earlier today, was introduced. But for those who couldn't make the morning session, Gary is responsible for Schneider Electric's partner business for sourcing, product development, supplier management. Much of that, of course, coming from Asia, but in particular China. If I could then introduce Anne-Laure Decour, from Director of Apparel and Sourcing for APAC at Puma, where she looks after the apparel sourcing organization and processes covering fabric, research and development and production in China, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia and Indonesia. And apologies, I like to think of myself as an international person, but whenever I need to pronounce a French name, I realize I am just a simple Aussie at heart. And lastly, most importantly, Ringo Mak from Blue Box International, where he is president of what is a 60-year-old Hong Kong toy company, and not only, and perhaps the only supplier on our panel today, but more importantly, a firm that is looking to also build out its own branded goods. So, absolutely delighted if we could give our panelists a warm welcome. What I thought to do, because we have such a mixed group, everyone has quite different views, certainly works in different parts of the supply chain, but also sectors. I'll ask specific questions to each of our panelists. Paul, if I could start with yourself. Samsonite exited the manufacturing business some time ago, focused purely on sales and marketing. We'd love to hear more about your reasons for that decision, and the advantages, but also the disadvantages of that.
Okay, well, first of all, we have to go a little bit back in time. Samsonite originally was a manufacturing company. We had our own factories all over the world, in the Americas, in Latin America, South America, Europe. Asia was, of course, not a market in those days. And it was really manufacturing driven. Whatever we were producing, our salespeople were supposed to sell it. It was quite easy from a manufacturing standpoint. Things had changed, and there were, in fact, two things that changed the dynamics, and that's about 10 years ago. It went together with a change of management, and that was increased focus on retailing. We thought that going forward, if we wanted to keep our destiny in our own hands, we had to take care of the retail channel. Especially in Europe, we saw the retail channel, the mom and pop stores, was going down. With department stores, you never know. So we decided, let's go more into retail. Now, retail retail is quite capital intensive. You have to pay for the rent, the store renovation, the inventories, salespeople, and that requires a lot of money. In addition to that, you need to invest heavily in advertising and promotion. So all the money that we have available for investments, there it goes. However, there was a second point, that is that we also discovered at those days that our factories in Europe and the States were not very competitive anymore, and we had to do something. Going to China, of course, was the easy choice, but very soon we also discovered that we, as an international company, we could not do that as good as the Taiwanese companies, as the Korean companies, the Hong Kongese companies. They do it in a much more efficient way than what we ever could do as an American company. There is only one exception to that. We decided to keep the high technology manufacturing in-house. It's also very simple. That's the part of the business where there is a lot of know-how that is really proprietary to our company. It's very capital intensive, and it is not so much labor intensive. And that's the reason why today we still have a factory in Belgium, we have a factory in Hungary, and the same technology we are using in our factory in India that is supplying to the Asian market. All the rest we have outsourced. One more thing is also, if you invest in your own factory, you know when we set up the factory, but we have learned today the world is changing fast. So what is a good location for your factory today is a complete wrong location for your factory tomorrow. And then as an international company, to close factories and go somewhere else, first of all, mostly we are not the fastest to do that, and you come in the press, there's a lot of advertising around that. So if you outsource, you are also much more flexible. This is one thing. There are risks linked to the outsourcing. We took a decision that none of the factories that is working with us is working only for Samsonite. We want to be the biggest customer at the factory, occupying 50, 60, not more than 70% of the capacity. That means, as a consequence, that the remaining 30% have to sell somewhere else. Somewhere else means to our competition. We do protect ourselves through all the usual things of protecting your intellectual property through patents, design registrations, copyright. We have made them sign non-disclosure agreements and so on. But still, it remains a very, very thin line. Because we also invest in the factories indirectly. We go there, we teach them how to become more efficient, we teach them what they have to do to become more stable and consistent in quality. Now, needless to say, if they do that for us, they will do the same also for the remaining 30-40% of their capacity. Still, we tell them, whatever they produce for us, for whoever the competition is, they cannot make a product, even if it's not clearly within the patent or the design registration, they cannot produce any product which is inspired by any of our products. And I have to say, this is manageable. So that's a little bit where we are today, and maybe later we can come back to the fact if some of them become competitors or not.
Would be great. And I think that's an apt moment to turn to Ringo. Clearly, to listen to Paul, to be both a manufacturer and a retailer of branded goods is challenging. It almost feels like you have to make a choice between one and the other. At this point in time, you are in fact both a manufacturer and a retailer. So from a supplier's perspective, what are some of the challenges of making that transition?
First of all, lucky enough, I'm not doing the luggage manufacturing for you in the past. In fact, too, now our group has a spread of like a 50-50. 50 is doing our own brand, and the 50% of our capacity is doing OEM for other big toy brands. Also, we have a big portion supplying to a French company like Carrefour, Auchan, Kingsway. It's under other people's brand, okay, but it's our design. So now the terminology is called ODM. Okay. To answer your question is that everybody knows most of the Hong Kong or China manufacturer, or including Taiwan manufacturer, they used to face this kind of 80, 90, the last decade is massive manufacturing, OEM manufacturing. But when we try to start our own branding, own marketing, the key thing, surprisingly, is not really capital, it's not really on the market. To my kind of limited knowledge and kind of experience, is the mindset. It's the mindset of your shareholder, it's the mindset of your management, the mindset of the team that really work on that particular project. Because they used to be, okay, I just take the order from Samsonite, I'll do like 100,000 units just to fit the quality and the compliances, and that's it. But doing your own stuff, and our market is totally different. So we have to really segment our market in order not to be in direct conflict with our customers, which is still a good part, important part of the business. So that, the mindset, how to balance all this, I always call myself a ball juggler. I have to juggle many balls, okay? In order, on one hand, please the existing OEM customer, which is serve a very big turnover of our group. On the other hand, let room to gradually build a non-conflict brand for ourselves. I forgot to mention our brand now. You saw our logo is Blue Box, but the brand we are doing is B-Kids. It's an infant toy brand. So you can see in Hong Kong, in China, in gradually more and more in Europe, it's tough. Tesco, Sainsbury, or Auchan, Carrefour will never get this brand now. Okay, but eventually we want to really get it by the specialty market gradually. So the just simple response is the mindset of your team. Okay, certainly provided you have the capital, because the cash turn is totally different. For a manufacturer, the maximum you would expect would be like 90 days, 120 days. But if you do your own retailing, own marketing, own branding, you could easily talk about 240 days. So you need to have a lot of money, a new bunch of people to manage your business, a new kind of a partner to handle your different market. And to us, another key thing is how to pick your strategic market. For us, in instance, certainly Greater China and the emerging market, not in USA, not in Europe. Okay, so that is some of my sharing.
Fantastic. Gary, I know you're already seeing local competitors emerge. What is the impact on your business? How do you change your business model in response? And could you describe some of the changes in the behaviors and even aspirations of your suppliers?
So, first, if we look at the landscape today, the manufacturing, industrialization, R&D capabilities of suppliers, I'd say in Asia, have dramatically improved. That is largely in response to companies such as ourselves that wish to see better performance and quality management with these suppliers. So I think we are partly the reason for that drive, and it becomes part of their value proposition to businesses when we select them and when we grow with them. At the same time, we're today clearly in a digital age. We just saw the presentation about TradeSpark, okay, which is interesting. And also the retailers over the last, say, 15, 20 years have opened up their sourcing offices in Asia. So we find ourselves in a landscape where there's a lot closer proximity between our traditional customers and our traditional supply base. At the same time, there's been cost pressures in the market. We tend to see cost inflation. So this has brought conflict, I would say generally, for all different parties. And so in answer to the question, kind of are today's suppliers potentially tomorrow's competitors, or even yesterday's suppliers today's competitors, the answer is possibly. And I think there's mixed cases, and it depends on the type of business that you're in and the type of business that you are. I think, for example, for Schneider, we are still fundamentally a manufacturer. So the majority of our purchasing is at component and part assembly level. And so in this particular case, I'd say no, there is not that degree of risk. Okay, that. I'd also say there's less risks if you're in a kind of a high-end project business or a business that requires local solutions and expertise. Probably there's also less risk for retailers. I think the higher risk is if you are a lower branded offer. Perhaps if I go back 10, 15 years ago, companies which were importers, where they acted as a very good connection and a conduit between Western countries to source in the Far East, and they had a very big value proposition, and that value proposition has eroded. So I think those companies will continue to find it quite difficult, particularly as the retailers are looking to buy direct from manufacturers. That type of low branded offer and importer, I think, will continue to find it hard. For Schneider, as I say, because we're dealing a lot in components, there's a large portion which is unaffected anyway. But the same I'd say is Samsonite, that we look for innovation, differentiation. We have a number of patents to protect us, IP clauses in our contracts, exclusivity agreements, and good partner long-term selection.
And your average second-tier brand in the UK or US would struggle with those?
I believe so. I think, for example, the company that I was in, GET, was a very interesting business for Schneider because it had a good market share and it had very nice product and design. For us, in terms of the long-term vision that we would have seen, we think that at least the retail side of our business would have continued to have been under pressure because of the nature of the closeness and the proximity.
Understood. Thank you. Anne-Laure, we come to you last, but for a very deliberate reason, and that is because your industry has seen the threat from local competition for some time now. And I'd be very interested to know, in your experience, for the firms, or the local firms that succeeded, how did they succeed? And for those that failed, why did they fail?
I think you have to distinguish two phases in this brand building in China. The phase one was about 15, 20 years ago, where you have, in the apparel business, basically the sports industry and the menswear industry were the ones where manufacturers decided to go into brand and retail. And during that phase one, the China market was completely open. There was no offer. So basically, whoever would have the capital to start building a brand had an open market with no competitors to compete with. And at that moment, you even had European retailers like the Bestseller Group or the Itam Group in France moving into China, starting their own stores operation in China. And very funny enough, today, for the Chinese consumer, they look like Chinese brand. The Chinese consumer don't realize that the Vero Moda or Itam is really a European brand. So that's the phase one. And I would say that phase one was fairly easy. Now, I think on phase two today, and the sports industry is a good example of the challenges that happening now for the brands in China. In the sports industry, with the Chinese Olympics in Beijing that happened in 2000, few manufacturers decided to go into having their own brands and distribute in China. One being Li-Ning, you have the 361, you have Anka, you have X-Step. These guys decided to try their luck. And because of the demand of the market, they were very successful until the Chinese Olympics. But these past many years, because handling a retail operation, a brand operation, requires a clear DNA of the brands, a clear logistic and a clear approach to building up a collection. After the Chinese Olympic phased out and there was a pure reality of the market, they had to compete with the big brands, would be Nike, Adidas, Puma, not too much to be honest, but mostly Nike and Adidas. And Nike and Adidas today are still the main drivers of sales for the sports business in China. The reason being that building a DNA for your brand takes time. You have, as Christophe Roussel was saying from Tesco, you have to understand the customer demand. And the customer demand in China is changing very quickly. And I think the foreign brands have the capability to adapt much faster today on the customer demand. So as of today, if you look at the sports brands, there were 10 brands. Now it's been reduced to 4 brands. And their market share is actually not that big. And they've been struggling for these past 3-4 years with very huge inventories. And they had to phase it out last year. So I mean, everybody who is in the sports industry heard about Li-Ning problems these past 2-3 years. And as a matter of interest, Li-Ning decided to change the management team and brought in a lot of foreign people, mostly Americans or Europeans, to manage the brand in China. So, as you were saying, I think the key element here is skills and people. This phase 2, I think for China is becoming more challenging. Now, when we were exchanging, preparing this panel, I think something which might be more of a threat in the future is the financial capabilities of a lot of Chinese manufacturers today. And you were showing all these nice logos as a starting point here. My previous company, Li & Fung, being a good example of companies having a lot of money to spend and starting to buy brands in Europe or elsewhere in the world because they realize actually it's much easier to acquire a brand which has already a history or a DNA or whatever and plug it into the China market. So I think the main risk today is not really having manufacturers moving into the retail or the brand business because I think now the entry ticket in China is too expensive. I think the main risk is having more of these Chinese very rich companies going abroad and acquire companies in Europe or in the States and make use of that for the China market.
Now, I find the importance of the home market fascinating because it obviously wasn't critical 10 years ago, but in your industry, clearly sales in this part of the world are large and growing. To what extent then are your local competitors who are looking to build out a branded good, to what extent are they targeting this market? And to what extent are they targeting foreign markets? Is that critical?
It is not critical at the moment. What we see indeed is that there are a number of factories that produce for us during a couple of years. They become more mature and then they look what is the next step. Do they increase their manufacturing capabilities or will they do something else? Now, I have seen a number of examples of people who start indeed their own brands because they look at the FOB price at which they are selling to us. Then they go to the stores and then see how somehow there's a difference between the retail price and the FOB price, and they think, oh, that's all profit. And we all know it's not true. So, in addition to that, they always tell us that there is pressure from the local governments for local Chinese companies to start building their own brands. I don't know if it's true, but that's a story that I get everywhere. Now, I have to say, till now, nobody of them I have seen becoming successful. Because they all start, and just like Anne-Laure says, you need to have a lot of money to go into retail. Because they have no brand, so nobody knows them. There is no DNA. Then they have to invest in retail space. Now, retail space in China is very expensive because that's the first market that they always approach, China, because they think they know China. They are Chinese. They have their connections. Once they start going into that venture, unless they have very deep pockets, but within a couple of years they realize that they cannot be good at both. Or you are very good and focused at manufacturing, or you become a real retailer, like we have done. But to do both is a very, very difficult exercise. We do have a couple of examples of people who have existing brands here in Asia and by extension in the rest of the world. But these are people who had, most of them are Taiwanese, who had long established brands in Taiwan. And they are still in manufacturing and then they are in retailing. But at the same time, also these people, they struggle. Because ultimately, and that's good for companies like most of us, in Asia, people like to buy a brand with a history. That they can say, oh, I bought that, it is 100 years old, it's 150 years old. That's what they like. There is only one thing that may change the dynamics going forward, and that's internet. Because for internet, there is no barrier. You produce, you put a brand on it, you open a web store or you work with one of these so many websites, and then you can start selling. But also there, at this moment, there are limitations because the same thing. There is some brand on it that nobody knows. So how can they convince consumers to buy their products from the internet? That's only by offering a very, very low price. And at that very low price point, that's not where we compete.
Well, Ringo, in answer to two of the issues that Paul raised, was it a deliberate strategy to focus on the local market and why? But also, given that such a large share of toy sales are made online, is the cost of retail space doesn't seem an issue for you. Do you have a specific online strategy?
Sure. We got both this kind of strategy. Actually, the whole idea of getting our own brand started is because of the Greater China market has become more mature and mature, and now everybody try to get in. Okay. In fact, in the past, many mega brand, toy brand, did get into China, but all got burned. Okay. Now they are starting to harvest. Okay. And for local manufacturer, local product developer, and yourself, we just start our brand 3 years ago. Okay. But we got the advantage of comparing to overseas companies. We know we got the network, we know who to call, and all legit. Okay. But still, a lot of this subcultural things, we got an advantage. Okay. So for that local, we try not to do the retail. We partner with those distributor, regional guy, which we know who can do the best. Not the biggest, but the one that could fit our kind of scale. Okay, so we did almost 2 years of screening and then try and error. Now we got a good kind of spread of this kind of distributor or partner. Some we invest, some is just buy and sell, but under very specific terms. How are we going to monitor our brand, the product, merchandise, so on and so forth. Okay, so that is the Greater China strategy. Online strategy is true. Right now, Amazon, everybody know. 3 years back, when I talked to my US guy, my UK guy, my France guy, they said, oh, no, not yet there. But last year, everybody ringing the bell. Now we got hurt by Amazon. Everybody's checking the price in Amazon, or they feel the goods in the store, in the department store, in the supermarket, but they actually push the button on Amazon to get purchased. Even cross-border, that is really scary. They bought it, like in France, they bought it from Spain. Cross-border, they got like the 20% lower. That can't happen. So that's a very big thing there. So what we try to do, the online strategy, is make it regional. So lucky enough, with our 60 years of history, we got tons of this kind of design product. So we could segment different kind of product for different kind of selling channel. So in short, the consumer cannot buy the same item in this particular online channel versus what we are doing to the mass market. So that is our initial strategy, and it works.
Fantastic. Gary, I was fascinated. Your industry requires heavily investment into research and development. Now, you spoke earlier today about the innovative capacity of some of your suppliers. Can I ask, what is the driver of that change in innovative skills? Is it a younger generation? Is it a better educated generation? Is it funding from local governments? Is it pressure from pressure from buyers?
I think there's definitely an expectation from us as manufacturers and even retail businesses for that level of innovation. And I think it probably started more from a subcontracting perspective. And a lot of things we've heard today is about things like clothing, products, and other things that I wouldn't say it's the creativity part of the R&D, which is the value proposition of those suppliers. From what I was listening to, for example, from the previous panel, is more about their manufacturing, industrialization, and cost competitiveness. Okay? So I think these things are being driven by us as customers. But then, with the world becoming a smaller place, then naturally those companies, particularly now with generations of Chinese factories, we saw something earlier, I think it showed a lot of companies which are in the 20 million to 100 million bracket suppliers, where the son or daughter's done their degree overseas, they may have done a marketing degree or something like this, they come back into the parents' manufacturing business and they look to expand their business. So that can certainly change the behaviour in that way. But coming back on some of the earlier points as well, there's retail and there's retail. Okay? So and as you pointed out before, there's different segments that we can operate in, and then there's also professional retail and there's wholesale sectors. And we would have experience of buying from companies that also would sell into the same geographies without conflict, because we're selling differentiated offers into different segments. And I think that can also be achieved. I think the biggest danger is when a company has been supplying a product from one factory to a main customer or customers, and then that factory starts talking directly with those customers and supplying them direct. It can happen. My experience is it's quite rare. I have experienced more colleagues or ex-colleagues who have become competitors than factories that have supplied us that have become competitors.
Thank you. And Laura, what are some of the strategies you might recommend, certainly the garment sector, to protect yourself from local competitors?
In the garment business, the cycle is so short, it's difficult to protect yourself, frankly speaking. So, I mean, Zara has, 15 collections a year, so the speed is probably the only thing that can protect you. Now, in the sports industry, where R&D is a big part of the product development, pattern, definitely, as it's a key thing to protect your brand. But again, in this apparel industry, it's all about understanding what the consumer wants, to deliver it fast enough, and to tell a story. If you don't tell a story and if you don't understand what the market wants, then you're out of the market. And I think now the foreign brands, are also pushing boundaries for the Chinese retailers, because these big players like Inditex Group or H&M going into China, of course, is pushing Chinese retailers to improve themselves. Now, the capability in design, the capability in creation, the capability in R&D is growing. As you just said, I think the younger generation has been educated abroad, and they have a lot of capabilities. We need to see, but definitely one thing that I don't think that's going to happen quick is to have Chinese brand going overseas. I think at the moment they're very busy trying to address their own market, which is a huge market. I don't think that the threat of them going overseas to Europe or to the US is really there. I think it's going to take quite some time before they fix what they have to do in their own market. It's going to take some time before they move out. So that, in a way, protects the foreign brand in their own market in particular. But again, it's all about skills and people and getting the right leadership to manage your business.
Fantastic, thank you. Very enlightening. I thought to open it up to questions. I think we have 10 minutes or so.
Not too sure if anyone has any questions, but I was going to kick off, and I wanted to ask Paul. I read an interesting statistic earlier this week about the bag and luggage business. And the statistic was something like there are now 26,000 luggage and bag companies in China. 26,000. So, how do you deal with that?
Well, you don't work with all 26,000, obviously. But the market, it's a very wide market, and also we talk about luggage, but there's much more than luggage. There's luggage, there are business cases, there are backpacks, and the way the industry is organized is you have main factories, but a lot of them work also with small subcontractors. So, as international companies, you work with few, and then they have a network of subcontractors, where you have to be very, very careful working with these contractors. So it's something that we don't like to do, to work with subcontractors. We go to a factory and we tell them we want to work in your factory and we only want to see our products there. Don't give us a surprise that all of a sudden we discover that you go somewhere else. And also on the price points, it goes from the very, very cheap stuff that you only can use once and then you throw it away, till the very expensive stuff. And also more and more, we see that even the high-end, the luxury brands are producing in China. But indeed, it's a big amount, and some of them are really also very small. It's a few people that work somewhere in a garage. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not 26,000 real big factories.
And how about the China market itself for Samsonite? Because, again, there's a growing passion for brands. I think Chinese consumers, we talk about the Chinese marketplace. The Chinese consumers themselves, love those Western brands. One of the reasons behind all of these luggage companies, bag companies, was that they were talking about how China's appetite for things like leather bags is growing exponentially. I mean, any?
Yeah, exactly. And this is what we witnessed in China. But at the same time, I've been working in China for approximately 16, 17 years now. I have seen the changes. When we entered the China markets, first it was quite difficult. Nobody is waiting for you as a company. Nobody. Then you start to find your place in the market. And in the early days, the most important thing for the Chinese customers was it should be a European brand and it should be expensive. That's it. And then they were ready to buy from it. Now, in the last couple of years, I really see how educated the market is becoming. I wouldn't today rate our China markets. And by the way, and you can find that we are a listed company, it's available. China is our second biggest market worldwide after the United States. Second biggest market. Today, I would rate our Chinese customers to be equally demanding and equally picky as the Japanese. Before we always said, oh, Japan is the most picky market. We even had situations where when we were manufacturing for China that we were doing extra quality control to make sure that only 100% perfect products were going to be shipped to Japan. Now I can say China has replaced Japan in terms of being demanding. People know what are the latest trends. Everybody is on internet. They are still prepared to pay a premium price for a good product, but they expect premium service too. Premium service in terms of retailing environment, but they want to go to a store where they have the full selection of products, where they get good explanation about the products, about the features. They look at the workmanship. If they see a sewing line that is not very straight, they will ask for a different product. And also, if something goes wrong and a repair has to happen, they expect the repair to happen within 24 hours.
Right.
But at the same time, I consider that to be good news, because this is an area where we as an international company and as an established company, where we can make a difference between us and many of the competition, because we have the spread, we have the reach, and we can deliver that.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing, of course, now in China is that, in China, for China, that domestic market is growing. I think Anne Law absolutely hit the nail on the head when she was saying that right now, today, those Chinese companies are far too busy dealing with their own domestic market, with all the issues, because China is a big place. It was interesting as well this week, I think, the Hurun, Rupert Hoogworth, the Hurun report, the China Rich List was out, and of course a record number of millionaires and billionaires across China, I'm sure, buying up more of your products. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions? I know we're in the last session, but I'm sure there's going to be some questions and some comments in the audience with regards to suppliers today, competitors tomorrow. Any views from our Belgian friends? Oh, views from our South African friends, or South African French friends.
Tatiana, South African for rugby, French otherwise.
Okay.
I'm interested from the point of view of manufacturing. We've heard a lot today about different countries in Asia having a cost advantage in terms of manufacturing. And I've done a lot of manufacturing, not only in China, but moving offshore for a very minute percentage advantage, especially when you offset all the logistics and transport costs and the cluster of materials, moving materials offshore. And I tend to get the feeling that the future about sourcing, partly sourcing in a country for the country, but I think for China, I'm not so sure this is correct. I'm interested to know from Samsonite's point of view, or maybe from the toy manufacturing and or maybe from your sports side, are the retail taxes in China selling from a Chinese manufacturer into the Chinese market directly higher than the import duties from exporting first the product out of China, re-importing it into China, or manufacturing offshore and having some duty-free advantages into China? This is the first part. And the second part, does it also mean that in future the manufacturing in these countries is more about, we touched on it earlier this morning, on free trade agreements and duty-free entry into export markets rather than a pure labor cost advantage? And I'm specifically talking about places like Myanmar or Vietnam or the Philippines. We spoke, I suppose, more about the region in terms of labor cost, but my question is more the overall landed cost in the export markets, and not only the export markets that are Europe and America and what we've been talking about, but the world's largest future market, which is China.
Okay, Tatiana, thank you for that very short question. I can put you in touch with a very good tax advisor.
I can answer on the upper side of the business. If I look at the China market, domestic market, it's mostly sourced in China for domestic. However, you see a trend now for big retailers like Little Banui to start sourcing outside of China, Bangladesh, for instance, being a destination for them, interestingly. Well, if I take the example of Puma being a multi-country brand, there will be more and more a tendency to source locally. One reason being the speed to market, because if you're in India and you have to import from somewhere, first of all you have the import duties, of course, but you also have the speed, and I think speed, at least in the apparel industry, is becoming one key criteria today. So the tendency will be probably more relocation of sourcing closer to the sales countries, and what Christophe was saying earlier on Europe, manufacturing for Europe sales. I mean, definitely China is the case. Now, something that we discussed also on labor costs earlier, frankly speaking, on the apparel industry, if you look at the costing, at the cost structure of apparel, today is more than 50% coming off material. The pure CMT is only 30%. So labor cost is one issue, it's not the only issue. It's just part of it. So that means that, everything can be basically sourced anywhere at that stage.
Ben, any views from your side about those trade flows? Because you've been doing a lot of work looking at the movement of goods.
Other than again, to repeat, we see this across a variety of sectors. So it's not just limited to the sourcing sector. And one of the common complaints we get from multinationals to us is that our business is growing, but also growing in complexity. So we're going into multiple countries, multiple cities, first tier, second tier. We're seeing global competitors, local competitors, regional competitors. It's very challenging. I think we'll continue that way.
And I think also, Tatiana, if you look at those OECD ratings in terms of difficulty, in terms of tax jurisdictions, unfortunately, a lot of those places like China rank, I think, number 2 behind Brazil. But there's also a lot of those other Asian jurisdictions. So tax, unfortunately, is not going to go away in the foreseeable future. Veit, have you got an interesting question?
I'd just like to
Better be interesting.
comment. No,
it's going to be a comment.
It's going to be interesting. It's going to be. I'd like to comment to what you were saying. We have a jeans business in China. Obviously, we're selling here in brand in China. So when I make jeans outside of China, I'm about 15 to 20% cheaper landed because it's ASEAN countries duty free into China. The biggest problem there is really, as you said, is speed. So the first deliveries you normally can't catch when you manufacture something in Vietnam or Indonesia and ship it to China, because China has this CIQ, this lovely quality control, which has the highest standards that I've ever seen anywhere in the world. It's weird. They make the most crap actually produced in some instances, but then they have the highest standard when you sell into the market. So that adds up to 30 days to your lead time. It adds 30 days to ship the fabric out to the manufacturing place. So you're adding 60 days to your lead time, and it restricts you a lot in what kind of products you can actually move ashore. But if you move offshore, my experience is 15 to 20% savings.
Okay. Thanks, Veit. Any other final comments before we wrap up? I'd just also like to very quickly tell you an interesting story. I was recently pulling together a report on luxury in China, and I visited a company called Ximi. Has anyone ever heard of Ximi? But a very interesting company. The lady, a very, very dynamic entrepreneur, is a lady called Linda Liu. And she started trading in shoes back in 1986. And she's got some fascinating pictures of her on this little bicycle, riding to various companies with all these shoes on the back of the bicycle. She then found enough money, got together enough money, I think $600 to kind of start the business. Then she opened a factory in Chengdu, in Sichuan. So she started manufacturing, working again OEM, working with a lot of the European companies and labels. And today she has developed her own label, Ximi. That's the label. And I think the fascinating story there is that she's gone from trading to manufacturing. Now she's gone into retail. And a couple of weeks ago, I visited her flagship store on the Bund. And I can send you the details, the locations of the Ximi flagship store. And I was really impressed. Well, I wasn't impressed with the prices because she's doing the very fine, intricate, embroidered shoes. Amazing fashion designer type shoes, a little bit Jimmy Choo, kind of a little bit like Jimmy Choo, but fine embroidery, 30,000 renminbi per pair. Quite amazing. But she's done some reverse engineering. She's now got European designers working with her team in China, designing her new range for spring, summer, and then autumn, winter. But I just thought that was quite a remarkable story in terms of, you know, from being a supplier, but just this fascinating story from being literally back in '96 on her bicycle, selling shoes into manufacturing, and now she is literally looking at potentially opening up a number of these Ximi high-end shoe stores. And she told me a couple of weeks ago that she is going to look at Paris and London and a couple of other interesting places. We were trying to get her here today to join the panel, but she unfortunately couldn't make it. But again, you know, that's one story. So I'm not too sure. Are we going to see a lot more Linda Liu's and Ximi corporations?
If I can make a comment to that, and that may be one of the exceptions. My experience with all these factories in China, and maybe luckily for us as Western companies, they are very good in manufacturing, they are very good in product development, but really the real R&D, where people just start from a white sheet of paper, coming up with something real innovative, I haven't seen, almost not seen. And also on the design part, whatever the local companies are doing is all copy and paste. An element from this, an element from that, put it together on one product. Mostly it's not the best match. So indeed, the companies that, or the Chinese companies that eventually might become successful in the future, are those who can combine their manufacturing capabilities with Western talent. Western talent in terms of running the companies, R&D and design, because that's, yeah, it's, we hear these people, they have so many degrees. But it's not by going to a school and studying that the next day you're a creative person. Because what they have done, they are good in reproducing. Also at school, they are good in reproducing. Does not mean that they are creative. So, but this is where we are today. It's changing fast, and 5 years from now it can be a very different story.
I agree, but I think the interesting thing, and Ben, you and I have seen this in terms of talking to a lot of companies, is the phrase, the speed of change. You know, things are happening so much faster here than perhaps I've seen happening elsewhere around the globe. The final kind of sum up, if you like. Ringo, I mean, Blue Box, are we going to see you guys on a global stage?
You In fact, I would like to firstly comment on the Paul's point. Actually, you will be amazed because I have been helping the local design field to support China on upgrading the design creativity. But for some companies, especially these large companies, they actually go direct. They don't want the so-called mediocre. They don't want even Japan. They go to Europe, they go to US, Frog Design, go to the best design house to get this project. Exactly, to bring up the creativity, send the team there, send their team over. So I would dare to say within 5-10 years, there will be some very stunning design on the fashion, on the product, on a lot of areas will be from China.
Okay. Good point, Ringo. Anne Law, your views? Should we be worried? Should the multinationals be worried?
Again, there is a lot of cash there. You know, buying competence for them is possible. Buying companies definitely happens. If you look at the Lianfu model today, how many brands they've acquired in the past few years, that is definitely, yes, it is.
Gary?
Okay, I think I'm with Ringo on this one. But in actual fact, I think a lot of this R&D creativity is already there. When I look at electrical electronics, I think we would be quite surprised about how skillful and creative now that the global companies have become. So yes, there should be a concern, and I think the concern should be more for some companies with lower brand values though than others.
To finish up,
I think we
final comments?
should be worried about specific Chinese companies. I think some will succeed spectacularly, but whether we can apply that to the country as a whole, unless we're convinced. So a tale of two cities, two companies, two countries.
A tale of two cities, a tale of two companies, two systems. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree, a very fascinating final discussion panel. Suppliers today, competitors tomorrow. The jury is still out, but we shall certainly see what happens within the next 5 to 10 years. Please join me in thanking our moderator, Ben Sipendorfer, our esteemed panelists, Ringo, Paul, Gary, and Anne Law. Thank you very much.